Now, in order to understand the Versailles Peace Treaty, we must first understand Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. So, now these 14 points were the principles or proposals made by US President Woodrow Wilson in 1918 to guide the settlement after World War I and prevent future wars. So Woodrow Wilson wanted justice and impartiality to be extended to the defeated powers. He believed that injustice or unfairness on any of the belligerents countries that fought would take Europe and indeed the world back to the bad old days of war. It was against this background that he came out with 14 points or principles or ideas, which was the basis upon which peace was concluded with Germany and her allies. These points were the outcome of his critical analysis of the causes of World War I, and he made sure that they were accepted at the Paris Peace Conference. We should also observe that the Treaty of Versailles was not negotiated as Wilson wanted, but dictated by the victor powers upon the vanquished powers. It was simply presented to Germany, and it was asked either to accept it in 5 days or face an invasion. Germany had no better choice than to sign what they called dictated peace. It is also important to understand that even at the time of signing the treaty, the German delegates, led by its foreign minister, were humiliated. They were kept in a hotel behind barbed wires and were not allowed to communicate to anybody. They were escorted in and out of the Hall of Mirrors where the treaty was signed, like criminals escorted to and from the dock by prison warders or policemen. Anyway, let us assess or let us analyze Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. So we are going to follow the exact chronological order for better understanding. Point 1 was about open diplomacy and no secret treaties. So all diplomacy and negotiations between the states was to be carried out openly, frankly, and in public view. Wilson stood for mutual trust and confidence between nations through consultations and settling of disputes openly. This was to avoid secret treaties and alliances that had caused World War in 1914. However, this was never implemented since the victor and defeated nations of Europe had very high nostalgia for revenge. Point 2. Freedom of the seas or navigation. Wilson stressed absolute freedom of navigation on the seas in peace and war, except in territorial water. This was partly due to the fact that naval rivalry and the determination of Germany and Britain to dominate the sea had caused the naval race and led to World War I. On this sensitive issue, Wilson was outrightly opposed by Lloyd George of Britain. Britain could easily welcome the destruction and limitation of German navy, but not equality at sea. He argued that a stronger navy was a luxury to Germany, but a necessity to Britain. Then point 3, removal of economic barriers. He proposed the removal of trade barriers between states in international trade. This is because colonial economic rivalry and the policy of protectionism had partly contributed to the First World War. This point worked to suit America, whose industries and trade were not significantly ruined by the war. However, other powers were so much devastated by the war that their industries and trade needed tariffs and other protective measures. They therefore rejected the idea, after recovering in the long run. Then point 4, reduction of armaments or an end to the arms race. Aware that arms race had contributed to World War I, Wilson's fourth point emphasized that nations should give guarantees that they would, quote, disarm to the lowest level consistent with domestic safety. While this provision was fully applied to Germany and her allies, other powers did not reduce the level of their arms. This gave Hitler an excuse to rearm Germany, which resurrected the arms race in the interwar period. Then point 5, adjustment of colonial claims. Emphasis. Here, he emphasized impartial adjustment to all colonial claims in the interest of the colonized. Here, the interests and the sentiments of the colonized were to be considered equal to those of the governments given to mandate or control. This went without any opposition from Britain, France, Belgium, and Japan. This could be explained from the fact that they all wanted to gain from Germany's empire rather than gain from the colonized people. Point 6. Evacuation of Russian territory and self-determination. According to this point, Germany was to evacuate Russian territory because the Brest-Litovsk Treaty of 1917 was forced onto Russia by Germany because Russia was defeated. Russia was to be assisted in every way that, quote, she may need and herself desire for the free determination of her future. This idea went unopposed. However, the principle of free determination of her future accelerated the success of the 1917 revolution, which upset democratic governance that Wilson and his associates had projected. Point 7. Restoration of Belgium's sovereignty or independence. Evacuation and restoration of Belgium's independence. Belgium was the nucleus of World War I. Germany and her allies had to withdraw all their forces from Belgium. This was accepted by both Britain and Germany, since it was a primary factor why Britain declared war on Germany. Then point 8, return of French territory, that is Alsace and Lorraine. This point provides for the evacuation and restoration of French territory and the righting of the wrongs done to France in 1871 as far as Alsace and Lorraine were concerned. On this point, Wilson was successful since France recovered the two territories and even redressed the wrongs done to her by Prussia at Sedan in 1866. Britain also saw it right and fitting. Then point 9, readjustment of Italian borders. This point provides for readjustment of the borders of Italy, in quote, along clearly recognizable lines of authority. Italy was a member of the Triple Alliance but entered the war on the side of the Triple Entente. However, she lost some territories during the war. She had to be rewarded and compensated with some of other territories. Wilson did not encounter any opposition since this was in accordance to the principle of nationality and a way of rewarding an ally against an enemy. Point 10. Self-determination of Austria-Hungary. Point 10 states that all peoples of Austria-Hungary were to be offered the opportunity of independent development. Austria was hitherto made up of about 13 different races. This was a success since Britain and France could not deny democratic governments or obstruct the principle of nationality in Europe. Better still, the dissolution of Austria-Hungary and the new independent states posed no security problem in Europe. Point 11. Independence for Balkan states. This point stresses the evacuation and restoration of Serbia, Montenegro, Romania, and an outlet to the sea for Serbia. Political and economic independence was to be granted to even other Balkan states. The Allies adopted this point with the hope of settling the historical and contagious issues that had destabilized Europe. This was finally effected in the Treaty of Saint-Germain with Austria on 20th July 1919. Point 12. Sovereignty for Turkey and other Ottoman lands. This point suggested the readjustment of Turkish territories and breaking up of the Ottoman Empire. Various nationalities under Turkey were to be granted self-governance or independence, while the Turkish population was to form an independent Turkey. The Dardanelles was to be open to ships and merchants of all nations. Wilson was not opposed by Britain or France, who stood to benefit from the freedom of navigation and trade with the newly created states. This was later concretized by the Treaty of Sevres in 1920. Then point 13, the establishment of an independent Poland. This point states that an independent Poland be created in those areas solely or, in quote, indisputably Polish, and the Polish state had to be granted a free and secure access to the sea, that is, Adriatic Sea. Although this was not opposed by the Allied powers, there is sufficient evidence to justify that the created Poland of 1919 was neither indisputably Polish in population, nor her access to sea was without territorial dispute. Both decisions incorporated and violated Germany's territory. This explains why Germany invaded Poland in 1939 to begin the Second World War. Finally, point 14, the formation of the League of Nations. So this point provides that an international organization be formed to guarantee the independence of all states, both great and small. This gave rise to the League of Nations, whose role was very instrumental in maintaining world peace up to 1939. So, in simple terms, if the 14 points were followed, Europe could have had peace after 1918. But as noted above, these points were violated. George Clemenceau, the aging premier, who was nearly 80 years, dismissed the 14 points, cynically calling it the 14th commandment, adding the contrast that the good Lord had only 10. He emphasized the fact that God gave us 10 commandments. We broke them. Wilson has given us 14. We shall see. This man, George Clemenceau, had excessive hatred for Germany and the Germans. He had twice seen Germany's invasion of France during his lifetime and never wished to see France attacked for the third time by Germany. He therefore prayed for the destruction of Germany in order to avoid humiliation of France by Germany, like in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. So although Lloyd George admired and valued Wilson's 14 points, he could not support him since the English people had a lot of negative feelings towards Germany. George himself had just won an election with a promise to, quote, hunger the Kaiser and make Germany pay. So this was his slogan, hunger the Kaiser and make Germany pay. These influenced him to support George Clemenceau during the conference. Thus, the difference in opinion between Woodrow Wilson on one hand, George Clemenceau and Lloyd on the other hand, had a lot of influence on the final terms of the Versailles Treaty of 1919. In other words, Lloyd George and Clemenceau outcompeted Woodrow Wilson, which made the Versailles Treaty very unrealistic in resolving the post-war problems.